Hello, thank you for being here and attending this British Council online conference for teachers. I hope you've been enjoying the sessions today and you're full of motivation and ideas to take back to your colleges, schools and universities. And thank you for sticking around for one of the final sessions today, this talk on podcasting. My name's Craig. I teach at the British Council Centre in Valencia. And I also write material for an online website called mansioningles.com. And I've been podcasting with a friend and co-host since 2014. My friend Reza Shah and I publish a weekly podcast, and that can be found at inglespodcast.com. So here's what the talk looks like. I'd like to tell you about 3 separate studies that I've done with my adult students in Valencia. And the overall aim is that you'll be able to take away some ideas and strategies around podcasting that will benefit your students and your colleagues. The first part of the talk looks at a study on podcast listening that I did with B2 students for self-study, specifically to improve their exam results in the listening test. They were having lots of problems getting a high score in listening. The second is a different study comparing audio podcasts to video to see which medium is more effective in improving listening. So video versus audio. Not as exciting perhaps as Superman versus Batman, or as Alien versus Predator. But anyway, video versus audio, and where should our students be focusing their time to improve their listening most? The most recent study, number 3, which sadly was cut short by the coronavirus in March this year, focuses on the students creating and publishing their own podcasts as a speaking task in the classroom. So let's get started though with a podcast definition. What is a podcast? And it's funny, years ago when I first started talking about podcasting, and I'd ask the audience, how many of you were not sure what a podcast is? Half of the audience would raise their hands. But the last few years, there's been a shift, and podcast has become a lot more mainstream. And most of you, I'm sure, have heard of podcasts. Basically, audio on demand, time-shifted content, be it audio or video. And it means that the listener can listen or watch podcasts whenever and wherever they like. You can subscribe to podcasts, which means they appear as if by magic in your podcast player, usually on your phone these days. Podcasts are free, and the barrier to entry to create a podcast is very low. So the good news is that anyone these days can make a podcast. The bad news is that anyone these days can make a podcast. There are over 1 million podcasts available, and there are some not so great podcasts out there, which means we have to be selective on the podcasts that we suggest and recommend to our students. But we'll speak a little bit about curation later and how you can help your students find good and useful content. Now, have your students ever had problems with listening comprehension, especially with exam listening? In 2016, I asked myself this question: can listening to podcasts improve students' listening comprehension? I can hear you saying yes, but I wanted to measure it somehow. So I did a study with my B2 first exam class, and the study was called the Podcast Challenge. And this is what it looked like. I had 16 Spanish adults in a B2 first exam preparation class, and I asked for volunteers to do extra homework, and I found 8 volunteers who were willing to go above and beyond. And that involved listening to podcasts outside the classroom. So in addition to their normal homework, they had volunteered to invest some time to improve their listening, and I would help them find content and subscribe to podcasts according to their likes and their interests that I thought would help to improve their listening skills. Now, half of the class then only did the in-class listening that exam students would normally do in a preparation class, and they do the normal homework that we'd set, but usually that homework is not listening comprehension. We tend to do the listening comprehension in class from the textbook. And the other half listened to podcasts and reported back to me every week, telling me which podcasts they had listened to and how long they'd listened to those podcasts. And I helped them subscribe to the podcasts on their phone, and I set them up with a bank of podcasts to listen to. All of the students in the class did a full 40-minute past paper B2 Cambridge listening test at the beginning of the course to get their level, and they did another test 10 weeks later so that the results could be compared. And here are the results. Group A, the blue group, only did the in-class listening. So they were the control group. And Group B in orange represent the students who did the extra podcast listening. As you can see from the first test on the left, the students who volunteered to do the extra listening had slightly better listening comprehension skills to begin with, but you might expect that because they were the volunteers and obviously highly motivated to do the test. But you can see from the second test on the right that there's definite improvement from the students who were doing the 10-week listening challenge and listened to podcasts in their spare time. So significant improvement from the podcast listeners. And based on these results from 2017, I've been encouraging students to listen to podcasts for self-study, showing them how to subscribe on their phone, encouraging them to listen, helping them with curation, to tap into their interests and their hobbies, etc. As a slight digression, I'd like to say here that it's possible to really niche down with podcasts a lot more so than with popular mass media platforms like the BBC or NPR podcasts in the US, National Public Radio. The independent podcasters will cover practically all your students' hobbies and interests, from anything from wooden boat building to pygmy pony breeding. There's the Pen Addict podcast, in which two people only speak about pens for an hour. And there's even this one, the wonderful Chameleon Breeder podcast, which took me a long time to find, actually. So there's lots of choice. If you find out what your students are into, and obviously you may have to help with the curation, but once they're hooked on a podcast or two, then you can pretty much leave them to it, and then the improvement in listening will take care of itself. Fast forward to 2018, and I noticed that many of my students were watching lots of TV shows and TV series. It was round about the time of True Blood, True Detective, Breaking Bad, The Walking Dead were in the middle of that. The Vikings. Some had Netflix accounts. They were watching on HBO because of the Game of Thrones. And they were watching on Amazon Prime Video, illegally downloading lots of series in English, and of course the TV packages that many of us have in our homes where you can switch to original version. That was available for them. They were watching a lot on YouTube, and they were watching a lot on a platform called Twitch, Twitch. I don't know if you've heard of Twitch for video games. It's a gamer platform. Lots of people speaking in English and commenting while they were playing video games, and many of my students were addicted to that channel. So with so much content, with the students being exposed to so much content, video content in English, I started thinking about this. Which improves listening comprehension more, video or audio? What do you think? I mean, on one hand, video has images that may help the students with comprehension. Perhaps it's easier for them to follow the story when there's video and pictures. However, on the other hand, maybe the images in video are a distraction from the audio. But then the students who did the first study that I just showed you were mainly multitasking while they were listening. They were doing other things. So again, not the same as sitting down and concentrating 100% on the audio, as I do when I have my siesta and listen to the BBC. Now, all of these academic studies have found positive effects on learners' listening skills when using video in some cases. But none of these studies measure the effectiveness of both mediums, video and audio, on comprehension for Cambridge listening exams specifically. So should we be encouraging our classes to watch more videos in English before their exam as part of their self-study preparation? Or would their comprehension improve more if they listen to podcasts? In other words, how can they best spend their time? So I started another study at the British Council, Valencia, based on this question, but this time it wasn't only limited to B2 students, to my class. I asked all of the teachers in the centre at B2 and C1 level to help me with their students, and we gave handouts to a total of 271 students. From those 271 B2 and C1 students, only 58 showed interest, 15 couldn't make the date and time I had arranged, 43 said yes. However, on the day, only 29 came. So we had 17 B2 students, adults, all adults, and 12 C1 students. And as before, with the previous podcasting only study, I gave all of the students on the day that they came a full 40-minute past paper exam listening test at their respective level. And then I brought them all together and I explained the study and what would happen. And this is pretty much what it looked like. If they participated in the study, they would have to choose between only listening to podcasts for 14 weeks, audio podcasts, or only watching TV series or any video content in English with no subtitles. And they should not have seen the content before in Spanish. I explained that I would help them get started with recommendations based on their interests, and I'd send them an email every Sunday so that they could tell me the number of hours that they had listened or watched each week, and also what they had watched or listened to. And students did another full test 14 weeks later to measure their progress at the end of the study. And I would also help them by email on a weekly basis with recommendations for listening and watching. I also asked them on the same day their preference if they chose the podcast route or the video route. At the time, I had personally a B2 first preparation exam class with 10 students in it. So I used that class as a control group, and I only did in-class listening with them. And I gave them a full listening test at the beginning of the term and another at the end of the term so that I could compare the results of this 10-student control group. Now, this is a very simplified and condensed version of the results, and I've only included students who started and finished the study. So That's a little bit confusing perhaps. Let me move to a bar chart which shows the results a lot clearer. So this bar chart shows the data in a clearer way. The brownish reddish color shows the result of the first test, and blue shows the results of the second test. The podcast listeners are on the left, and in the middle we have the students watching TV series, and the control group, the class that I had, is on the right. As you can see, there's not much difference in improvement between the control group and those watching video, but there is a bigger jump with the students who listen to audio podcasts. I think it's also worth mentioning that the control group were exceptionally strong. It was a particularly good class. So the B2 students, some scored A's in that class and B's in the Cambridge exam in December. And 80% of that class passed the exam. So 8 students out of 10 got the exam. And here in green, you can see the hours that the students actually spent listening or watching. And yes, the podcast listeners were spending more of their time actually listening in self-study than the video watchers. But they were, in most cases, multitasking. The podcast listeners were probably at the gym, walking the dog, etc., whereas the video watchers were probably in front of the screen. I mean, you can watch your mobile phone when you're on an exercise machine, perhaps, but not when you're driving. So although they spent more hours actually listening, they were doing other things at the same time. What were they doing, the podcast listeners, what were they doing while they were listening? I did ask them, and these were the answers they gave me. They listened to podcasts while driving, preparing food, cooking, etc., washing up, walking dogs, exercising, cleaning, shopping, and traveling on public transport. Those were the main activities that helped them improve their English while they were multitasking. How can you go about curating podcasts for your students? If their level is a strong B2 or above, so C1, C2, then they should be perfectly fine with podcasts that have been created for native English speakers. Although obviously, if you can listen to those podcasts before you recommend them for a few seconds just to make sure it fits to their level. And how can you find them? We'll just go to Google and Google the hobby, the pastime, the profession of the student, and then the word podcast. So photography podcast, tech podcast, business podcast, marketing podcast, travel podcast, cooking podcast, gardening podcast, etc. And then you should be fine. Apart from these podcasts that are created for native speakers, there are also native English speakers. There are also special ESL podcasts that have been created for students of English. The BBC have a wonderful selection, and there are also podcasts that have been created by independent educators. If you're wondering what I recommend to my students, obviously I recommend our podcast, English Podcast. This is the website, and there's a search box for searching for a particular grammar or vocabulary area, etc. Now, when you listen to a podcast from a website web player, you're not actually notified when there's a new podcast available. And that's where the idea of subscribing to a podcast comes in. So when you or your students have discovered a podcast that you really like and you want to follow, it's a good idea to use a podcast app to subscribe to your podcast, your favorite podcasts. And scrolling down a bit on our webpage, you can see the icons on the right-hand side to the more popular applications for listening and subscribing to podcasts. On Android phones, you've got Google Podcasts that you can find in the Google Play Store. Just activate the app and download it to the home screen on your Android phone. Spotify have a wide range of podcasts now. And for people in Spain who listen to music on ebooks, I'm not sure if it's ebooks or iBooks. I think it's ebooks. They have a wide selection of podcasts. And if your students have an iPhone or an iPad, of course, there's Apple Podcasts, and the icons are a purple icon on their home screen. And once they've subscribed to a podcast, every time a new one is released, it will automatically appear in their podcast player. And all of these are free. So again, the main ones, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. There are third-party apps that you can also install on your phone. For iPhone, Overcast is the app to get. It's free. And for Android phones, Pocket Casts is a very good podcast app, but that costs €4. So one or two thoughts and reflections, some takeaways on this second study with video versus audio. All of the students that took part in the study said that their listening had improved. When they did the second exam task and when they did the listening tasks in class, they said they understood what they heard, pretty much everything they'd heard. However, they did have problems in some cases answering the questions, doing the tasks. So obviously a balance needs to be struck between general listening and exam-based listening tasks. Some students still had problems doing the exam tasks despite understanding what they heard. Also, during the study, 3 of the students started listening to podcasts at the beginning of the study and then later asked to change to video halfway through. And I didn't really want them to do that, but I didn't feel I could say no. And when I asked them why they wanted to switch, one student said that she found videos easier to watch. So videos perhaps are more entertaining. But then again, perhaps that was my fault. Perhaps I failed that particular student by not curating well enough and finding content that was compelling and interesting for her. 2 students said that they couldn't find podcasts that were interesting enough, and they also tended to be younger students. And Generation X's and Millennials are more immersed in video culture, perhaps. Their audio listening consists of music and not the spoken word. That was certainly my case when I was younger. So podcasts tended to be more popular with older students. And finally, during the study, I found the email exchanges, the weekly communication that I had with the students really helped to create an accountability for the students to keep listening. We discussed briefly the podcast and videos that they were watching and listening to, and it was fun for me, and I hope also for the students, to be swapping recommendations. Although on reflection, perhaps a WhatsApp group would have been a better way to communicate. That would have created a space for the students to interact together, discuss opinions on content, make recommendations, and stimulate one another's motivation. So to summarize that particular study then, if you only do in-class listenings with your students, you can expect approximately a 7% improvement in your students' listening over a term. If they're watching video at home for self-study, we found a 9% increase and 15% increase in their listening comprehension with podcasts. And incidentally, the increase in their comprehension score for the exam in the first study was 11%. So over 10% increase for sure. One final thought before we leave these 2 studies on listening comprehension. In-class listening, in my opinion, is clearly not enough for students who are living in a country in which the target language is not being spoken around them or heard naturally in the media. They need to seek it out. We need to help them find extra material and guide them in order to improve their listening, especially when it comes to exams. So those first two studies focused on the receptive skill of listening. Let's move on to production now and how to help our students with their speaking. Fast forward to 2019 and I found myself teaching a C1 general English class of adults using British Council in-house material. The students had booklets divided into units, and each unit had a topic focus and contained vocabulary and some language practice based around that topic. And at the end of the unit, the students had to complete a task that, in theory, brought all the language aspects together. Each lesson had an aim, usually in the form of a speaking task that the students were working towards. Here's a selection of some of the tasks from the first two terms, that's October 2019 up until March 2020 this year when COVID hit. These are some of the tasks that the students had to do at the end of each class. So traditionally, perhaps in a lesson, we might input the target language from the coursebook unit, then set up the task, let the students prepare for a while, then they would do the task for the teacher, and then we would give them feedback. And I thought, I wonder how effective student-centered podcasting would be in this situation in class as a tool to improve fluency, pronunciation, and their self-confidence. And how useful could podcasts be to reduce their disfluencies in speaking? And by disfluencies, I mean the false starts, the rephrasing, repeated syllables, umming, ahhing, which native speakers do also naturally, but the language students learning a second language tend to do even more. So I was hoping that podcasts would help them with their disfluencies also. So I asked my C1 students if they'd mind experimenting with creating podcasts for the final 30 minutes of every 3.5 hour class. And thankfully, they all said yes. We used this free podcast host to host a podcast. It's called Anchor, Anchor. It has its own landing page, as you can see. And when you submit a podcast to Anchor, it automatically publishes the podcast in iTunes, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. And because many of the third-party podcast apps that I mentioned earlier scrape podcasts from Apple Podcasts, they also get listed in apps like Pocket Cast, Overcast, and iVoox, etc. While the students were recording the podcasts, they used their own phones, and it was not necessary to use any extra equipment like an external microphone. These days, the microphones in a modern mobile phone, it was good enough for this podcasting test. I did coach students on holding their phone so that the microphone was very close to their mouths, and also finding a quiet place, a quiet room with no background noise of traffic or other people speaking. So it's good to find a library or a staff room or a spare classroom where there's no extra noise in the background. There were some problems at first publishing multiple podcasts under one account. So in the beginning, I created one account that was called the C1 English Challenge with one password. And when the students were recording several podcasts at the same time, it kind of clashed and they would not upload to the host, Anchor. So to solve that problem, the students formed groups of 4. There were 12 in the classroom, so 3 groups of 4, and 1 student from each group had the responsibility of creating an account for that group. It's important that all of the students in each group make a note of the username and password of their account in case the group leader is missing in the next class. So all of the students need to be able to access the platform to upload their podcast. Here you can see some of the podcasts that the students created. We'll hear a couple of short audio examples in a minute. The students, 1 or 2 of the students were slightly technically challenged, so I gave them my phone, they used my phone, but this was pre-COVID days, so maybe the idea of interchanging phones needs to be looked at very carefully at the moment. But as a side note, I did have one final class on Zoom because in April my teaching centre owed the students one more class, and we recorded the final podcast using Zoom's recording feature, and we managed to do a podcast episode online at the end of the class. So it's also possible to do this using Zoom's recording feature. Now, if the task at the end of the unit happened to be a group task, then they would simply pause the recording and then pass the phone on to another student and continue the conversation. For example, an interview scenario, they would pass the phone backwards and forwards as they're asking questions and answering questions. For short solo presentations, they recorded themselves, then re-recorded, and when they were happy with the final product, they could publish their podcast. If they were not happy with the recording, they would often get peer feedback or help from me on how to improve their particular segment, and then they would re-record. So this idea of constant improvement and re-recording really helped them with their fluency and other aspects of their English. This shows you some examples of the podcast that they created on Spotify. So let's listen to 1 or 2 examples.
Have you ever seen a young child trying to catch a bus at 6 a.m.? What if I told you that he has to travel around an hour to get to school? Will you look away and leave him alone, cold and shivering? Believe me, it's terrifying.
Imagine Alex. He's 10 years old. He's from a small village where his parents have a farm. He wakes up at 5 a.m. every day and has 3 hours of commute to school. At the end of the day, he has to come back home in a filthy old bus. Why he has to move to another town to get a proper education? Why we abandon him?
The aim of Teachers Without Borders is to reuse abandoned school buildings to teach children in isolated villages.
We need your collaboration. Are you a teacher? Your contribution will make all the difference to these children. Join us as a volunteer, but anyone can help. Books, furniture are also welcome. Visit our website, Teachers Without Borders.
If you are a lover of high technology and you feel passionate about video games, this electronic device is for you. How many times have you played video games and your fingers get tired? With this sophisticated high-tech gadget, you could exercise your fingers and strengthen the muscles in your hand. Use this fashion and lightweight accessory. Don't hesitate. Buy it. Go to the store and buy it.
We are going to explain how to cook the typical Valencian paella. What do you think that a good paella have to have?
I think that a good paella must have stock, obviously, and it is possible to add spicy chorizo.
No, I don't think so. I think that it's better to have rabbit and chicken.
Okay, yes, it's better. Obviously, one of the main ingredients is the rice and saffron.
Yeah, and we can add green beans and butter beans too.
Okay, perfect. We have all the ingredients for a wonderful paella. Let's start.
Houses are smaller than ever. Don't you feel like a rat trapped in a maze? Safe space with all-in-one toilet and sink combination called ToilSync. ToilSync is an eco-friendly, sleek Portuguese device with a built-in computer that saves water, reusing the water that you have used in washing your hand or your dishes. Get your ToilSync now and start living in the future.
The students who took part were given a questionnaire to do at the end or towards the end of the study, and almost all the students found that the Anchor app that we used was easy to use. 2 students said that it was problematic at first, but then they got the hang of it. All students thought that it had helped their speaking in general, and in particular, their self-confidence. Although 4 students said they felt nervous at first having their voice recorded. But overall, they felt that their pronunciation had improved and that they had fewer disfluencies. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and no one thought that it was a waste of time. On the contrary, they all thought it was a worthwhile classroom activity. So, to summarize, creating these podcasts gave the students a real life task to do. They weren't just creating something for the teacher to look at or listen to. And they were excited to do it, a little nervous at first, but they were excited to record their podcasts at the end of the class after they'd prepared for the task. They had lots of practice and repetition, plenty of practice during the preparation stage, because they were also given time to prepare before they spoke, before they started recording. So there was the preparation time before they spoke, and then the re-recording and re-recording until they had a product that they were happy with. And that gave me opportunities to help them focus on any difficulties they were having, whether that be pronunciation, grammar, collocation, other language issues, and of course disfluencies. We focused on disfluencies a lot. Once the podcasts had been published, that gave me an opportunity to listen back and target any language areas that needed to be focused on in the future. And the students had a record, and still have a record, of their speaking, so that they can track their improvement over time. They recorded in groups in different locations, and they were very keen to hear the published podcasts of the other 2 groups. So even after we'd kind of finished the lesson, they were hanging around in the classroom listening to the work that the other students had produced. And as I mentioned before, feedback at the end of the year was via an anonymous student questionnaire. And here are some of the comments. There was space at the bottom of the questionnaire for the students to write their comments. And this is what some of them said. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope that was useful. Here are my contact details. If you have any comments, questions, I'm always happy to talk about podcasting, especially as it relates to teaching. So please get in touch, send me an email or tweet at me. And when you go back to your colleges and your schools and your universities, please let your colleagues and students know how podcasts can help them improve listening and speaking. Thank you.